The Elderly Woman's Secret, a life-changing lesson. Hook. What happens when the darkness finally fades and you are faced with the choice to redefine your fate? Emily has battled her fears, escaped her past, and now stands at the crossroads of her destiny. Will she embrace the unknown, or will the shadows of her past pull her back? Watch till the end to discover how one powerful decision changes everything. The journey is far from over. Stay with us to see what Emily chooses next. The wind howled through the empty streets as Emily walked down the narrow alley. Her footsteps echoed against the cold stone walls. A chill crawled up her spine. She had walked this path countless times before, but tonight felt different. The sky was dark, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. Only the flicker of distant street lamps broke the darkness. Something was off. She glanced over her shoulder. Nothing. Yet the sense of being watched lingered. Ahead, the door to the old cottage creaked. The same door she had always passed by without a second thought. But tonight it stood ajar. Her breath quickened. The air was thick, heavy with an unsettling silence. She felt drawn to it, as if the house was calling her. Her feet moved on their own, the pull too strong to resist. The door groaned softly as she pushed it open. Inside, shadows clung to the corners, the only light coming from the flickering fireplace. The smell of damp would fill the air. Her heart raced. A figure sat in the armchair by the fire. An elderly woman, her face hidden in the darkness. "Come closer, child," the woman's voice crackled. Emily hesitated, but something in that voice made her take a step forward. The woman's eyes glimmered faintly in the dim light. "Do you know why you're here?" she asked. Emily shook her head, words stuck in her throat. The woman smiled, her lips curling in a way that didn't seem kind. "You're in danger," she whispered. Emily's heart stopped. The room felt colder now. The shadows seemed to grow longer, twisting toward her. Suddenly, the fire sputtered and died. The room plunged into darkness. Emily's breath hitched. Then the woman's voice came again, sharper this time. "Don't you see? The one you trust will betray you." The silence that followed was deafening. A heavy pressure weighed on her chest. She could feel it now, the presence behind her. Someone had entered the room. Someone she had not heard approach. She spun around, but there was nothing. Only darkness, and the faint whisper of the woman's voice. "Run." The command was clear, but her feet refused to move. A soft laugh echoed in the void. Her pulse raced. The shadows shifted, and then the air turned cold. Too cold. Something was coming, something she could not outrun. The woman's eyes burned through the dark. "You should have listened," she said, her voice low and dangerous. The door slammed shut, and the room was no longer empty. Emily felt the weight of countless eyes on her, and in the heart of that suffocating darkness, she understood. She was not alone, her breath caught in her throat. The temperature dropped even further. She could see her breath in the air, swirling in front of her face. The woman's figure shifted in the corner, but her eyes never left Emily. The shadows around her seemed to pulse, alive, watching. Emily's heart hammered in her chest, each beat louder than the last. "Why won't you leave?" she whispered, barely able to form the words. The woman's lips curled again, her face twisting into something grotesque. "You're already too late," she rasped, her voice cold, each syllable laced with malice. Emily took a step back, her shoes scraping against the floor. Her eyes darted around the room, but there was no escape. No windows, no doors left open. And then she saw it. A figure standing just behind the woman in the chair. A man, his face obscured by the shadows, but his presence undeniable. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto hers. His lips parted. "Do you remember me?" he asked, his voice familiar. Emily froze. Her mind scrambled, but she couldn't place him. The man stepped closer, the shadows seeming to part around him, revealing his form. Then it clicked. The voice, the eyes. It was him, the man she had trusted, the one she had always believed was her protector. Her mind raced. No, it couldn't be. Not him. But the truth was clear now. The betrayal, the darkness, it all made sense. The woman laughed softly. "Did you really think you were safe?" she mocked. Emily's legs trembled, the weight of the realization crashing down on her. The man stepped into the flickering firelight, his face twisted in a cruel grin. "You should have listened to her, Emily," he whispered. "Now it's too late." The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing tighter and tighter. Her vision blurred, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadows surrounded her, suffocating her. And then the ground beneath her feet seemed to give way. Emily screamed as she fell, her body plummeting into the abyss. Down, down, into the darkness. And the last thing she heard before the world went silent was the woman's voice, echoing in the blackness. "Foolish child, you should have run when you had the chance." The fall seemed endless. Time distorted in the pitch-black void. Her body tumbled weightless, as if gravity had ceased to exist. Suddenly, her back hit the ground with a jarring thud. Pain shot through her spine, but it was fleeting, lost in the overwhelming darkness. She gasped for air, her lungs burning, but the air was thick, stale, heavy. She struggled to sit up, her hands brushing against cold, rough stone. The ground beneath her was damp, unnaturally so. The faint scent of decay filled her nostrils. She blinked, trying to adjust her eyes to the impenetrable blackness. Nothing. It was like being buried alive. Her fingers trembled as she slowly pushed herself to her feet. Every sound she made seemed amplified, too loud in the deafening silence. A whisper brushed against her ear. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was close, almost inhuman. She spun around, but no one was there. The cold seeped deeper into her skin. Her heart raced faster, her breath coming in jagged bursts. The shadows moved, undulating like a living thing. She took a cautious step forward, her foot sinking slightly into the wet ground. A distant sound reached her ears, a soft scraping, a dragging noise, then a low, guttural growl. Emily froze. Her muscles screamed in protest, but her body refused to obey. The scraping grew louder, closer. A figure stepped out of the darkness. It was the man, but not the same man. His face was contorted, his eyes black pools of emptiness. His skin was pale, stretched tight over bone, as if he had been long dead. The stench of rot followed him, clinging to the air. "Run!" The woman's voice echoed again, distant but clear. Emily wanted to run. Her legs were paralyzed, her body refusing to move. The figure grinned, the smile too wide, too twisted. "You can't escape," he hissed. "Not now. Not ever." And then, like a snap of thunder, the ground beneath her feet gave way again. She plummeted, the darkness swallowing her whole, falling faster, deeper. Her scream was cut short as the world around her exploded into a blinding white light. And then, nothing. The fall seemed to stretch on forever. Her body floated in the void, weightless. The darkness pressed in on all sides, an oppressive force. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the silence. Her heart raced faster, thudding in her chest like a drumbeat. The cold enveloped her, seeping into her bones. Her breath was ragged now, shallow. And then the voice returned. It wasn't the woman this time. It was something older, something far more ancient. "You can't escape," the voice crooned, as if it were the very air around her. Emily twisted in the void, desperate for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing. The pressure around her grew, suffocating, heavy. She wanted to scream, but the air was thick and caught in her throat. The whisper became a low growl, a rumble beneath the surface of her mind. Once you've entered, there's no way back. Emily felt the walls of the darkness shift, closing in around her. Her lungs burned, desperate for air, but the shadows pressed tighter. A cold hand brushed against her skin. She flinched, but there was no escape. The touch was clammy, like death itself. Her vision blurred as the shadows swirled faster, tighter, around her. A shape began to form in the dark. A figure, large, unmoving. It loomed, growing taller as if the darkness itself was molding into something monstrous. Her pulse thundered in her ears. A figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. It was the man, no longer just a man, but something far worse. His eyes burned with an unnatural, inhuman light. His mouth opened wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too many. "You were never meant to leave," he whispered, his voice a low hiss. Emily's body froze in place. She tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The shadow of the man stretched over her, towering, a presence so overwhelming she could feel it in her very soul. "You don't belong here," he growled. And with those words, the ground beneath her feet cracked wide open. The darkness swallowed her whole once more. And this time, there was no escape. The sensation of falling was gone. The darkness wasn't just around her anymore. It was within her. A suffocating weight pressed against her chest, her limbs frozen in place. Her mind raced, fighting against the paralysis that gripped her. And then a sound, a distant sound, faint but growing closer. A rhythmic, heavy dragging noise, like something large and slow moving through the fog. She could feel it now, something moving toward her, a presence, like an invisible storm, sweeping through the air. The whispers returned, growing louder, becoming a chorus of voices. "Leave now. Don't stay. Run." The voices, once a distant murmur, were now clear, urgent. Emily's pulse quickened. She was no longer sure if she could trust them. Her breath came in desperate gasps. She had to move, had to find a way out. Her eyes strained against the darkness, but it was still too thick to see clearly. And then, through the heavy shadows, she saw it. A glimmer of light, a faint, cold glow. It was small, but unmistakable. Her heart skipped a beat. The light flickered, casting distorted shadows on the ground, like something unnatural was moving with it. She pushed herself forward, each step slow, deliberate. The fog parted slightly, just enough for her to see more clearly. Ahead, the figure was there again, the man. But this time, his face was different. It was twisted, more monstrous than she remembered. His eyes burned with a fevered intensity. No longer human, no longer anything that resembled the person she once knew. He stepped closer, and the ground beneath her feet cracked with each movement. "You can't hide from me," his voice rasped, low and terrifying. A cold, cruel smile stretched across his face. He reached out, his fingers long and skeletal, grasping for her. The air around her thickened, suffocating. Her heart raced, her body trembling, but her legs refused to move. Then, something shifted behind her. The woman. She emerged from the darkness, her face now glowing with an eerie light. Her eyes gleamed with something darker, something more predatory. She stepped toward Emily, her movements too fast, too unnatural. "You should have listened," the woman whispered. Emily's world began to spin, the ground beneath her giving way once more. The light in front of her blinked out, leaving her in total, suffocating darkness again. The cold took over her body, her limbs numb. And in that moment, a single thought tore through her mind. There is no escape. Her final breath was swallowed by the endless void, and all that remained was silence. The silence stretched on, suffocating and complete. Emily's mind, disoriented, struggled to grasp anything, to hold on to something. Anything, but there's nothing. No sound, no movement, just a vast, endless void. Her chest heaved, her lungs burning with the need to breathe, but the air felt thin, impossible to draw in. Then, from the heart of that silence, a faint sound began to emerge, a crackling, like the dry rustling of paper. It grew louder, more distinct, as though something was shifting in the dark. A low, rhythmic sound, a pulsing, and then a voice. Emily. It was soft. Too soft, but unmistakable. Her heart skipped. The voice was the woman's, but different this time. Sharper, more confident. Do you understand now? The voice whispered. The fog began to lift, slowly, revealing a faint, distorted image in the distance. A figure. The woman stood there, her presence overwhelming, her eyes burning with unnatural light. Emily's chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body was still numb, locked in place. You wanted answers, the woman continued, her voice both soothing and cold. And now you have them. The shadows behind her twisted, forming shapes, impossible shapes, that flickered in and out of view. Nothing is as it seems, the woman hissed. The figures in the shadows seemed to grow, stretch, their forms jagged and unnatural. Suddenly, the ground beneath Emily cracked, splintering apart, revealing a yawning abyss. The woman smiled, her lips curling into a cruel, knowing grin. You have entered the final stage, she whispered, her voice turning icy. Emily's heart thundered. She felt herself pulled, dragged toward the edge of the abyss. She struggled, every instinct telling her to escape, but her body refused to obey. The edge of the void was so close now. And then, the woman's voice rose above the growing chaos, cold and final. This is your fate. And with those words, Emily felt herself fall once more, into the never-ending dark, into the unknown. Her body disappeared into the endless void. And the last thing she heard, before it all went silent again, was the woman's laugh, a sound that echoed forever. The void consumed her entirely, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. Emily's body was weightless again, floating in the endless dark. Her senses were dulled, her mind hazy. The laughter of the woman, cold and hollow, still echoed in her ears, lingering like a bitter aftertaste. She wanted to scream, but the silence that followed the woman's laugh was worse than anything she could imagine. It was absolute, a silence that held her captive, as if the world itself had stopped turning. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, the silence shattered. A bright light pierced through the blackness, sharp, blinding. It cut through the void like a knife. Emily gasped, the sudden light searing her eyes, forcing her to squint. She felt her body solidify again, her limbs tingling with sensation. For a moment, she thought she was free, but as the light dimmed, the world around her came into focus. The shadows had returned, surrounding her once more, but they were different now, twisted, distorted, like grotesque forms from a nightmare. The woman stood before her again, but she was no longer alone. The figures from the shadows had gathered, each one a grotesque mockery of human shape. Their eyes glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light. You thought you could escape, the woman said, her voice a mixture of pity and malice. Her eyes locked onto Emily's with an unsettling, knowing gaze. But Emily wasn't listening anymore. The fear that had once gripped her heart was now replaced with something else. Something darker. She could feel it growing inside her. The understanding, the realization. Her breath steadied. Her heartbeat slowed. No, she whispered, her voice trembling at first, but then firmer. No, this isn't the end. The shadows shifted, their forms twitching, as if reacting to her words. She stepped forward, her legs shaky but determined. "I am not afraid of you," she said, her voice gaining strength. The woman's face twisted into a snarl. "You think you can defy us?" she spat. But Emily didn't falter. She felt the darkness pulse around her, almost alive. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The woman raised her hand, the shadows responding like a storm, swirling violently. But Emily stood her ground, her mind clear. "I know now," she said, louder this time. "You want to control me, but you can't. You can't because I choose my fate." The darkness recoiled. The woman's eyes widened. "You think you have power here," she hissed. Emily nodded, her heart now steady. She wasn't trapped anymore. She could feel it in her soul. The shadows began to pull away, retreating from her, as though afraid of her newfound strength. And the woman, she faded. Her twisted grin vanished, replaced by a look of disbelief. She began, but her voice trailed off. The darkness around them seemed to crumble, the weight lifting, the oppressive cold dissipating. The world shifted once more, and Emily's feet touched solid ground. She was no longer in the endless void. But standing before the woman's defeated form, Emily understood. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The ground beneath Emily's feet felt solid, grounding her as the darkness around her continued to dissipate. The woman, now fading into the shadows, watched her with a look of pure disbelief, her eyes narrowing as the air thickened with tension. "You think you've won," the woman sneered, her voice hoarse, a hint of panic creeping in. Emily stood tall, her chest rising and falling steadily, her mind clearer than ever before. The woman's form flickered, like a flame struggling against the wind. Emily's heart pulsed with a strange sense of power. She felt different, more than just defiant. She could feel the force of something ancient shifting within her. "No," Emily said, her voice steady but full of resolve. "I haven't won, but you have lost." The woman's form flickered again, her silhouette starting to fade entirely. The shadows surrounding them grew more frenzied, as if fighting to hold on to their grip on the world. But Emily was no longer afraid. She stepped forward, her step sure, her body no longer weighed down by the fear that once consumed her. "You're not real," she whispered, her voice cutting through the chaos. Her words were sharper than any weapon. The woman's eyes widened, her expression shifting from rage to something almost desperate. "You cannot erase what's already been done," the woman hissed, her voice cracking with the weight of centuries. "You are bound to this place, just as I am. You cannot escape what's inside of you." Emily's eyes locked onto hers, no longer feeling the coldness that had once paralyzed her. "You're wrong," Emily said, more firmly this time. "I'm free, and I choose my own path." The woman recoiled, her image trembling, as if the very fabric of her existence was being unraveled. A low, rumbling growl reverberated from the depths of the shadows, but Emily didn't flinch. She raised her hand, palm facing outward, as though pushing the shadows back with sheer will. The ground cracked beneath her feet, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause. The darkness froze. Then, in a burst of light that tore through the void, the shadows shattered. The woman let out a final scream as her form dissolved, her presence vanishing like smoke in the wind. Emily stood alone in the silence that followed, the echoes of her words still hanging in the air. The fog was gone. The darkness was gone. For the first time in what felt like eternity, she could breathe. She glanced around, unsure of what had just happened. Had she truly destroyed it all? Had she truly broken free? Her feet moved without thinking, stepping across the ground, now firm beneath her. And as she walked, she felt something new, a sense of purpose. The world was open again. Her journey was far from over. But she knew one thing for certain. She had escaped. She had broken the chains that had bound her. She was no longer the frightened girl in the shadows. She was someone else now, someone stronger, someone who knew her worth. And the path before her was hers to choose. The world around Emily began to shift, the air clearing as if the oppressive weight had finally lifted. The ground beneath her felt alive now, pulsating with energy, as though the very earth had awakened from a long slumber. She took a step forward, then another, her confidence growing with each movement. Her mind raced, reflecting on everything that had led her here. The darkness, the woman, the endless void. She had been trapped, a prisoner of fear and uncertainty, but no more. She wasn't the same person anymore. There was a fire inside her now, a burning clarity, and as she walked, she began to notice something strange. The air felt different, alive, as if the very world around her was aware of her presence, reacting to her newfound strength. The path ahead seemed endless, stretching out in front of her. But this time, she didn't feel lost. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like she was walking in the right direction. She felt the pull of something, a call deep within her soul, guiding her. It wasn't fear that led her now. It was something much stronger. Curiosity, a purpose, and perhaps destiny. She moved faster now, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. The world around her began to take shape, a landscape she didn't recognize, yet somehow felt familiar. The ground beneath her was solid, the sky above slowly turning from dark to twilight, as if the sun itself had been waiting for her to emerge. Suddenly, she stopped. Ahead, a figure appeared. It was a silhouette at first, standing in the distance. But as she drew closer, the figure took shape. It was an elderly woman, her face lined with wisdom, her eyes sparkling with a strange knowing. "Ah, you've made it," the woman said, her voice soft but powerful, the words somehow familiar. Emily's heart skipped. She had been expecting this. For a moment, she was unsure of what to say. I don't understand," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. "Who are you?" The woman smiled, her eyes filled with warmth, though her expression was tinged with sadness. "You were never meant to understand," she replied. "But you're here now, and that's what matters." Emily stared at her, her mind racing. "I'm free." The woman nodded slowly, her smile deepening. "Yes, you have broken the chains, just as you were meant to. But the journey is not over. The world is still waiting for you." Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. "How?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How do I move forward? What do I do now?" The woman's smile softened, her gaze never leaving Emily's. "You walk," she said simply, "one step at a time." And with that, the figure of the woman began to fade, slowly disappearing into the golden light that surrounded them. Emily stood there, her heart filled with a mixture of awe and realization. For the first time, she truly understood. She wasn't bound to the past. She wasn't bound to the darkness. The future lay before her, vast and unexplored, waiting to be shaped by her choices. And as the light grew brighter, enveloping her completely, Emily knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was ready. The light enveloped her completely, warm and all-encompassing, as though the universe itself was welcoming her back into its fold. Emily's heart raced, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was a feeling of anticipation, of possibility. She felt something stir deep within her, a power, a connection to everything that had led her here. The weight that had once anchored her down was gone, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly free. The golden light shifted and swirled around her, bending like a gentle breeze, and as it began to fade, she found herself standing on solid ground once more. The world around her had changed. No longer was she surrounded by the darkness and the cold, the suffocating shadows of the past. Now, the world was bathed in the soft glow of dawn. The sky stretched out before her, painted in hues of deep violet and gold, the air crisp and full of life. Emily blinked, taking it all in. She was standing on a path, one that seemed to stretch endlessly forward. The ground was rich and fertile, the soft earth beneath her feet a reminder of her journey from darkness to light. And ahead, she saw something that made her heart race. A figure, tall and imposing, stood at the edge of the path. But this time it wasn't a threat. It was a man, cloaked in robes, his presence commanding yet calm. His face was hidden in shadow, but his posture was open, welcoming. As Emily approached, the figure turned slightly, his eyes meeting hers. There was something familiar about them, something she couldn't quite place. "You've made it," the man said, his voice deep but gentle, echoing with the weight of ages. Emily felt a pull in her chest, a strange sense of recognition. The words, so simple yet profound, struck her in the core of her being. I don't understand," she said softly, stepping closer. "I thought I was alone." The man smiled, his features softening as he stepped toward her. "No one is ever truly alone, Emily," he said, his eyes warm with understanding. "You've always had the strength within you, but it took the journey to bring it out." She stared at him, her mind racing. The path, the journey, the darkness. It all made sense now. This was the next step. She had made it through the trials, the darkness, the despair. And now, the man was here to guide her forward. "The world is waiting," he said, extending his hand to her. "But it is you who must choose where to go next." Emily hesitated for only a moment before reaching out. Her fingers brushed against his, and in that simple touch, she felt the weight of her decision. This was her moment. The past was gone, and the future was hers to shape. The man nodded, as though knowing her answer, before she even made it. And with that, the path before them seemed to stretch even further, the landscape ahead vibrant with new possibilities. "Let's go," Emily said, her voice firm, steady. "I'm ready." Together, they stepped forward, and as they walked, Emily knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter. The darkness was behind her. The future was wide open, and she would face it no longer as a frightened girl, but as someone who had found her strength and her place in the world. The journey had just begun. The path stretched before them, winding through a landscape bathed in the warm hues of an awakening world. The air felt lighter, almost alive, vibrating with the energy of new beginnings. Every step Emily took seemed to echo through the earth beneath her, as though the very ground was responding to her presence. Beside her, the figure in robes moved with quiet assurance, guiding her without ever saying another word. His presence was calm, but there was an unmistakable weight to it, one that spoke of knowledge, of ancient wisdom. He wasn't just a guide. He was a part of this world, a part of what Emily was becoming. As they walked, the landscape around them began to shift. The soft earth beneath her feet slowly turned to stone. The trees that lined the path twisted and gnarled, yet still full of life. The horizon stretched out, vast and endless, offering no hints of what lay beyond, only the promise of discovery. "Where are we going?" Emily asked, her voice cutting through the stillness of the moment. The man glanced at her, his eyes filled with an understanding that went beyond words. "We are going to the place where choices are made," he said quietly, his tone rich with meaning. "It is not a destination, but a moment in time. A moment where you must decide who you truly are." The words lingered in the air, heavy with their implications. Emily felt the weight of them settle into her chest, and she couldn't help but feel a flicker of unease. She had fought so long to escape the darkness, to break free from the chains that had bound her for so long. But now, the question that lingered in her mind was no longer about her past, but about her future. "What if I don't know who I am yet?" she asked, the doubt creeping into her voice. The man smiled a small, knowing smile that seemed to hold centuries of secrets. "That is why you're here." They walked in silence for a while longer, the path winding its way through strange and unfamiliar terrain. The air had grown colder, the light dimming slightly as they approached a towering stone structure that loomed ahead, its jagged edges cutting into the sky like a dark sentinel. At its base, the ground was uneven, the stones slick with moisture as though the building had been standing for ages, untouched by time. The air felt charged here, as though the very atmosphere was thick with power, a force waiting to be harnessed. "This is it," the man said, stopping in front of the structure. "The moment of choice. The place where your path will be sealed." Emily's heart raced as she stepped forward, her feet heavy against the stone. She couldn't see what was inside the building, but she could feel its presence, a force that seemed to call to her, to pull her deeper. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, though she wasn't sure if it was from fear or something else. The man looked at her one last time, his expression serene, almost reassuring. "You will step into the heart of this place," he said, "and you will decide whether you walk forward into the unknown, or turn back and leave everything behind." The air around her seemed to hold its breath. The shadows of the building stretched, swallowing the light, as if it were waiting for her to make her move. Emily took a deep breath, her mind swirling with thoughts, memories, and emotions. She had come so far, fought so hard, to get to this moment, and yet, standing before the entrance, she realized how little she truly knew about what lay ahead. But she also understood one thing, deep in her bones. The choice was hers. She had the power now, the power to define her path, to decide who she would be, no matter what the world or her past had told her. Without another word, Emily stepped forward, her hand outstretched toward the entrance of the stone structure. The moment her fingers touched the cold stone, a surge of energy coursed through her body, vibrating down to her very core. The world around her seemed to shift, reality bending and twisting in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. But then everything stopped, and in that stillness, the choice was clear. She had arrived, and she would choose her fate. Emily's fingers made contact with the stone. A rush of cold energy surged through her, sending a shockwave of light and shadow rippling out into the surroundings. The very air crackled, with an intensity that made her heart race, and the ground beneath her seemed to pulse with life, as though everything was waiting for her to make the final move. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the weight of the decision pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. Her breath caught in her throat as she felt the weight of her choice, of all the choices that had led her here. And then the silence shattered. A sudden wind picked up, howling around her as if the world itself was awakening, as if the path she had walked had just been rewritten. The stone in front of her cracked and shifted, a deep rumbling sound filling the air. Emily instinctively stepped back, but the force of the wind pushed her forward, urging her onward. Without thinking, she stepped across the threshold, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The world inside the structure was unlike anything she had ever imagined. It was vast, endless, like a cavernous expanse stretching far beyond what the eye could see. The walls were etched with strange symbols, glowing faintly in the dim light. The air was thick with an ancient power, and yet it felt familiar, as if she had always been meant to be here. At the center of the space was an altar, a pedestal carved from black stone, its surface slick with a liquid that shimmered like oil. Above it, a faint light flickered, casting shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. Emily approached the altar, her steps slow but determined. She could feel the presence of someone, watching her from the shadows, but she didn't turn. She had come too far to let fear stop her now. She placed her hand on the altar's surface, and the light above her brightened. The shadows retreated, and for the first time in her life, Emily felt truly, unmistakably whole. The choice was hers, and she was ready to embrace whatever came next. The moment her hand touched the altar, the world seemed to stop. The light above her blazed brighter, and the ancient symbols on the walls pulsed with life. A deep hum filled the air, reverberating in her bones, as if the very fabric of existence was shifting in response to her presence. Emily closed her eyes for a breath. The weight of everything she had experienced, everything she had become, flooding her senses. The darkness, the fear, the endless struggle. It was all behind her now. In its place was something different, something stronger. When she opened her eyes, the altar in front of her was no longer a mere stone structure. It was a mirror, its surface shimmering like liquid glass, reflecting not just her face, but her essence. She saw the girl who had once been lost in fear, the one who had trembled before the darkness. But she also saw the woman she had become, the one who had faced that darkness head-on and emerged stronger for it. In that reflection, she saw herself not as someone defined by her past, but as someone with the power to choose her future. The realization hit her like a wave, sweeping over her with a force that took her breath away. "You are ready," a voice whispered from somewhere deep within, familiar and ancient, yet entirely her own. It was the voice of everything she had learned, everything she had fought for. She nodded to herself, feeling the strength that had been building inside her now settle into her chest like a quiet flame. The choice had always been hers, and now she could finally choose. Choose who she was, who she would become. Slowly, she stepped away from the altar. The space around her began to shift, the walls melting into light, and the cavernous expanse filling with a warmth she had never known. With one last glance at the mirror, Emily turned toward the path ahead, her heart light but steady. The journey wasn't over, far from it, but now she walked forward with a purpose. And with that, the world she had left behind faded into the distance, as she stepped into the new world she was destined to create. A world where she was no longer bound by the past, but free to shape the future on her own terms. The light enveloped her once more, and in its embrace, she found peace. The story of the darkness was over. The story of Emily had just begun.